Hello, good evening. We are going to be continuing our reading of A People's History of the United States. We are on Chapter 5. And again, I did just check the audio, but if there is any problems throughout the video or if there is a buzzing noise or anything of that nature, please leave a comment below and I'll get that problem fixed. Chapter 5 is titled A Kind of Revolution. So far we have read Tyranny is Tyranny, Drawing the Color Line, and Drawing the Color Line, Columbus Indians and Human Progress, and Persons of Mean and Vile Condition. And this book so far has covered up to this point early settlers coming over to the Americas for the first time, Columbus discovering the Americas, as well as the early slave trade and problems that stem from the Revolution, the American Revolution. So Chapter 5, A Kind of Revolution. And before I get into reading, I do want to say that the usual, subscribe to our newsletter, subscribe to our podcast, May 30th Alliance Podcast. I believe we are on all major podcast outlets. If you need a link, message a page, message myself, and give you a link to that podcast. So Chapter 5, A Kind of Revolution. The American victory over the British Army was made possible by the existence of an already armed people. Just about every white male had a gun and could shoot. The revolutionary leadership distrusted the mobs of poor, but they knew the revolution had no appeal to slaves and Indians. They would have to woo the armed white population. And the reason that it covered this in the chapter previous, but the reason that it say that slaves and Indians did not have no appeal, the revolution did not have appeal to slaves and Indians, because what was covered in that chapter is the fact that tyranny is tyranny, and a lot of these founding fathers, they weren't concerned with trying to equally distribute the power. They weren't concerned with trying to do these things in the best interest of all people in America. They was doing this for the best interest of themselves. It wasn't some type of thing that they had a problem with tyranny and they did this at the best interest of their hearts. They had a problem with the fact that they weren't in control and the fact that they weren't making as much money off the exploitation and off the slave trade that was occurring in the early Americas. This was not easy. Yes, mechanics and sailors, some others, were incensed against the British, but general enthusiasm for the war was not strong. While much of the white male population went into military service at one time or another during the war, only a small fraction stayed. John Shy, in his study of the Revolutionary Army, a people numerous and armed, says, they grew wary of being bullied by local committees of safety, by corrupt deputy assistant commissionaries of supply, and by bands of ragged strangers with guns in their hands calling themselves soldiers of the revolution. Shy estimates that perhaps a fifth of the population was actively treasonous. Holy shit. A fifth of the population was actively treasonous. John Adams had estimated a third opposed, a third in support, a third neutral. Alexander Hamilton, an aide of George Washington and an up-and-coming member of the new elite, wrote from his headquarters, our countrymen have all the folly of the ass and all the passiveness of the sheep. They are determined not to be free. If we are saved, France and Spain will save us. And again, this is important to point out that the free he is talking about the free from Britain. It's not talking about the slaves to be free. It's not talking about pushing these Indians into pushing these indigenous folks into reservations. He's talking about Alexander Hamilton being in control. He's talking about George Washington benefiting from the slave trade and things of that nature. Slavery got in the way in the South. South Carolina, insecure since the slave uprising in Stono in 1739, could hardly fight against the British. Her militia had to be used to keep slaves under control. The men who first joined the colonial militia were generally hallmarks of respectability, or at least of full citizenship in their community, Shai says. Excluded from the militia were friendly Indians, free Africans, white servants, and white free men who had no stable home. For the poor, who might rise in rank, acquire some money, and change their social status. Here was a traditional device by which those in charge of social order mobilize and discipline a certain population, offering the adventure and rewards of military service to get poor people to fight for a cause they might not see clearly as their own. A wounded American lieutenant at Bunker Hill, interviewed by Peter Oliver, a Tory, who admittedly might have been looking for such a response, told how he had joined the rebel forces. I was a shoemaker and got my living by my labor. When this rebellion came on, I saw some of my neighbors got into commission who were no better than myself. I was very ambitious and did not like to see those men above me. I was asked to enlist as a private soldier. I offered to enlist upon having a lieutenant's commission, which was granted. I imagine myself now in a way of promotion. If I was killed in battle, there would be an end of me. But if my captain was killed, I should rise in rank, and should still have a chance to rise higher. These, sir, were the only motives of my entering into the service. For as to the dispute between Great Britain and the colonies, I know nothing of it. John Shai investigated the subsequent experience of that Bunker Hill lieutenant. He was William Scott of Peterborough, New Hampshire, and after a year as prisoner of the British, he escaped, made his way back to the American army, fought in battles in New York, and was captured again by the British, and escaped again by swimming the Hudson River one night with a sword tied around his neck and his watch pinned to his own hat. He returned to New Hampshire, recruited a company of his own, including his two eldest sons, fought in various battles until his health gave way. He watched his eldest son die of camp fever after 6 years of service. He had sold his farm in Peterborough for a note that, with inflation, became worthless. After the war, he came to public attention when he had rescued 8 people from drowning after their boat turned over in New York Harbor. He then got a job surveying western lands with the army, but caught a fever and died in 1796. Scott was one of the many revolutionary fighters, usually of lower military ranks, from poor and obscure backgrounds. Shai's study of Peterborough's contingent shows that the prominent and substantial citizens of the town had served only briefly in the war. Other American towns show the same pattern. As Shai puts it, revolutionary America may have been a middle-class society, happier and more prosperous than any other in its time, but it contained a large and growing number of fairly poor people, and many of them did much of the actual fighting and suffering between 1775 and 1783. A very old story. The military conflict itself, by dominating everything in its time, diminished other issues and made people choose sides in the one contest that was publicly important, forced people onto the side of the revolution whose interest in independence was not at all obvious. Ruling elites seem to have learned through the generations, consciously or not, that war makes them more secure against internal trouble. The force of military preparation had a way of pushing neutral people into line. In Connecticut, for instance, a law was passed requiring military service of all males between 16 and 60, omitting certain government officials, ministers, Yale students and faculty, Africans, Indians, and a term that is used for a person of a mixed race. Someone called to duty could provide a substitute or get out of it by paying £5. When 18 men failed to show up for military duty, they were jailed, and in order to be released, had to pledge to fight in the war. Shai says the mechanism of their political conversion was a militia. What looks like the democratization of the military forces in modern times shows up as something different. A way of forcing large numbers of reluctant people to associate themselves with a national cause, and by the end of the process, believe in it. Here, in the War for Liberty, was conscription, as usual, cognizant of wealth. With the impressment riots against the British still remembered, impressment of seamen by the American Navy was taking place by 1779. A Pennsylvania official said, "We cannot help observing how similar this is." We cannot help observing how similar this conduct is to that of the British officers during our subjection to Great Britain, and are persuaded it will have the same unhappy effects. An estrangement of the affections of the people from authority, which by an easy progression will proceed to an open opposition and bloodshed. Watching the new, tight discipline of Washington's army, a chaplain in Concord, Massachusetts, wrote, "New lords, new laws. The strictest of government is taking place, and great distinction is made between officers and men. Everyone is made to know his place and keep it, or be immediately tied up and receive not one, but 30 or 40 lashes." The Americans lost the first battles of the war: Bunker Hill, Brooklyn Heights, Harlem Heights, the Deep South. They won small battles at Trenton and Princeton, and then, in a turning point, a big battle at Saratoga, New York, in 1777, Washington's frozen army hung on at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, while Benjamin Franklin negotiated an alliance with the French monarchy, which was anxious for revenge on England. The war turned to the south, where the British won victory after victory until the Americans, aided by a large French army, with the French Navy blocking off the British from supplies and reinforcements, won the final victory of the war at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781. Through all this, the suppressed conflicts between rich and poor among the Americans kept reappearing. In the midst of war, in Philadelphia, where Eric Foner describes as a time of immense profits for some colonists and terrible hardships for others. The inflation, prices rose in 1 month that year by 45. My fault for reading it that way. Prices rose in 1 month that year by 45%. Holy shit. Led to agitation and calls for action. One Philadelphia newspaper carried a reminder that in Europe, the people have always done themselves justice when the scarcity of bread has arisen from the avarice of the forestallers. They have broken open magazines, appropriated stores to their own use without paying for them, and in some instances have hung up the culprits who created their distress. In May of 1779, the First Company of Philadelphia Artillery petitioned the Assembly about the troubles of the middling and poor, and threatened violence against those who are grievously intent upon amassing wealth by the destruction of the more virtuous part of the community. That same month, there was a mass meeting, an extra-legal gathering, which called for price reductions and initiated an investigation of Robert Morris, a rich Philadelphian who was accused of holding food from the market. In October came the Fort Wilson riot, in which a militia group marched into the city and to the house of James Wilson, a wealthy lawyer and revolutionary official who had opposed price controls and the Democratic Constitution adopted in Pennsylvania in 1776. The militia were driven away by a silk-stocking brigade of well-off Philadelphia citizens. It seemed that the majority of white colonists who had a bit of land or no property at all were still better off than slaves or indentured servants or Indians, and could be wooed into the coalition of the Revolution. But when the sacrifices of war became more bitter, the privileges and safety of the rich became harder to accept. About 10% of the white population, an estimate of Jackson, Maine, in the social structure of revolutionary America, large landholders and merchants held 1,000 pounds or more in personal property and 1,000 pounds in land at the least. And these men owned nearly half the wealth of the country and held as slaves 1/7 the country's people. So not even 1/7 the slave population, 1/7 all citizens, all people in America. The Continental Congress, which governed the colonies through war, was dominated by rich men, linked together in factions and compacts by business and family connections. These links connected North and South, East and West. For instance, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was connected with the Adamses of Massachusetts and Shippens of Pennsylvania. Delegates from middle and southern colonies were connected with Robert Morris of Pennsylvania through commerce and land speculation. Morris was superintendent of finance, and his assistant was Governor Morris. Morris's plan was to give more assurance to those who had loaned money to the Continental Congress, and gave the support of officers by voting half pay for life for those who stuck to the end. This ignored the common soldier, who was not getting paid, was suffering in the cold, dying of sickness, watching the civilian profiteers get rich. On New Year's Day, 1781, the Pennsylvania troops near Morristown, New Jersey, perhaps emboldened by rum, dispersed their officers, killed one captain, wounded another, and were marching, fully armed with cannon, toward the Continental Congress at Philadelphia. George Washington handled it cautiously. Informed of these developments by General Anthony Wayne, he told Wayne not to use force. He was worried that the rebellion might spread to his own troops. He suggested Wayne get a list of the soldiers' grievances, and said Congress should not flee to Philadelphia, because then the way would open for soldiers to be joined by Philadelphia citizens. He sent Knox rushing to New England on his horse to get 3 months' pay for the soldiers. while he prepared 1,000 men to march on the mutineers as a last resort. A peace was negotiated, in which one half the men were discharged, and the others got furloughs. Shortly after this, a smaller mutiny took place in New Jersey, in the New Jersey line, involving 200 men who defied their officers and started out for the state capital at Trenton. Now Washington was ready. 600 men, who themselves had been well fed and clothed, marched on the mutineers and surrounded and disarmed them. 3 ringleaders were put on trial immediately in the field. 1 was pardoned, and 2 were shot by firing squads made up of their friends, who wept as they pulled the triggers. Damn. It was an example, Washington said. 2 years later, there was another mutiny in the Pennsylvania line. The war was over, and the army had disbanded. The 80 soldiers, demanding their pay, invaded the Continental Congress, headquartered in Philadelphia, and forced the members to flee across the river to Princeton. Ignominiously turned out of doors. As one historian sorrowfully wrote, John Fiske, The Critical Period, by a handful of drunken mutineers. What soldiers in the Revolution could do only rarely, rebel against their authorities, civilians could do much more easily. Ronald Hoffman says, the Revolution plunged the states of Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and to a much lesser degree, Virginia, into divisive civil conflicts that persisted during the entire period of struggle. The Southern lower class resisted being mobilized for the revolution. They saw themselves under the rule of a political elite, win or lose, against the British. In Maryland, for instance, by the new Constitution of 1776, to run for governor, one had to own 5,000 pounds of property. To run for senator, 1,000 pounds. Thus, 90% of the population were excluded for holding office. And so, as Hoffman says, small slaveholders, non-slaveholding planters, tenants, renters, and casual day laborers pose a serious problem of social control for the Whig elites. With black slaves 25% of the population, and in some counties 50%, fear of slave revolts grew. George Washington had turned down the requests of Africans seeking freedom to fight in the Revolutionary War. So when the British military commander in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, promised freedom to Virginia slaves who joined his forces, this created a consternation. A report from one Maryland county worried about poor whites encouraging slave runaways. The insolence of the Africans in this county is coming to such a height that we are under a necessity of disarming them, which we effected on Saturday last. We took about 80 guns, some bayonets, swords, etc. The malicious and imprudent speeches of some among the lower class of whites have induced them to believe that their freedom depended on the success of the king's troops. We cannot therefore be too vigilant nor too rigorous with those who promote and encourage this disposition in our slaves. Even more unsettling was white rioting in Maryland against leading families supporting the revolution who were suspected of hoarding needed commodities. The class hatred of some of these disloyal people was expressed by one man who said, "It was better for the people to lay down their arms and pay the duties and taxes laid upon them by the king and parliament than to be brought into slavery and to be commanded and ordered about as they were." A wealthy Maryland landowner, Charles Carroll, took note of the surly mood all around him. There is a mean, low, dirty envy which creeps through all the ranks and cannot suffer a man a superiority of fortune, of merit, or of understanding in fellow citizens. Either of these are too sure to entail a general ill will and dislike upon the owners. Despite this, Maryland authorities retained control. They made concessions, taxing land and slaves more heavily, letting debtors pay in paper money. It was a sacrifice by the upper class to maintain power, and it worked. In the lower South, however, in the Carolinas and Georgia, according to Hoffman, vast regions were left without the slightest apparition of authority. The general mood was to take no part in a war that seems to have nothing for them. Authoritative personages on both sides demanded that the common people supply material, reduce consumption, leave their families, and even risk their lives. Forced to make hard decisions, many flailed out in frustration or evaded and defied first one side, then the other. Washington's military commander in the lower South, Nathanael Greene, dealt with disloyalty by a policy of concessions to some, brutally to others. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he described a raid by his troops on loyalists. They made a dreadful carnage of them. Upwards of 100 people were killed, and most of the rest were cut to pieces. It has had a very happy effect on those disaffected persons, of which there were too many in this county. Greene told one of his generals to strike fear into our enemies and give a spirit to our friends. On the other hand, he advised the governor of Georgia to open a door for the disaffected of your state to come in. In general, throughout the states, concessions were kept to a minimum. The new constitution that were drawn up in all states from 1776 to 1780 were not much different from the old ones, although property qualifications for voting and holding office were lowered in some instances. In Massachusetts, they were increased. Only Pennsylvania abolished them totally. The new Bill of Rights had modifying provisions. North Carolina providing for religious freedom, adding that nothing herein contained shall be construed to exempt preachers of treasonable discourses from legal trial and punishment. Maryland, New York, Georgia, and Massachusetts took similar cautions. The American Revolution is sometimes said to have brought about the separation of church and state. The northern states made such declarations, but after 1776, they adopted taxes that forced everyone to support Christian teachings. William G. McLaughlin, quoting Supreme Court Justice David Brewer in 1892, that this is a Christian nation, says of... Let me start that over. I apologize. William G. McLaughlin, quoting Supreme Court Justice David Brewer in 1892, that this is a Christian nation, says of the separation of church and state in the Revolution that it was neither conceived of nor carried out. Far from being left to itself, religion was embedded into every aspect and institution of American life. one would look, in examining the revolution's effect on class relations, at what happened to land confiscated from fleeing loyalists. It was distributed in such a way as to give a double opportunity to the revolutionary leaders to enrich themselves and their friends, and to parcel out some land to small farmers to create a broad base of support for the new government. Indeed, this became characteristic of the new nation. Finding itself possessed of enormous wealth, it could create the richest ruling class in history, and still have enough for the middle classes to act as a buffer between the rich and the disposed. Rich and the disposed. The huge land holdings of the Loyalists had been one of the great incentives of the Revolution. Lord Fairfax in Virginia had more than 5 million acres encompassing 21 counties. Lord Baltimore's income from his Maryland holdings exceeded £30,000 a year. After the Revolution, Lord Fairfax was protected. He was a friend of George Washington, but other loyalist holders of great estates, especially those who were absentees, had their lands confiscated. In New York, the number of freeholding small farmers increased after the Revolution, and there were fewer tenant farmers who had created so much trouble in the pre-Revolution years. Although the numbers of independent farmers grew, according to Roland Berthoff and John Murin, the class structure did not change radically. The ruling group went through personnel changes as the rising merchant families of Boston, New York, or Philadelphia slipped quite credibly into their social status, and sometimes the very houses of those who failed in business or suffered confiscation and exile for loyalty to the crown. Edmund Morgan sums up the class nature of the Revolution this way: the fact that the lower ranks were involved in the contest should not obscure the fact that the contest itself was generally a struggle for office and power between members of an upper class. The new against the established. Looking at the situation after the Revolution, Richard Morris comments, everywhere one finds inequality. He finds that we the people of the United States, a phrase coined by the very rich Gouverneur Morris, did not mean Indians or black people or women or white servants. In fact, there were more indentured servants than ever, and the Revolution did nothing to end and little to ameliorate white bondage. Okay. I think this is the longest chapter. Carl Degler says, out of our past, no new social class came to power through the door of the American Revolution. The men who engineered the revolt were largely members of the colonial ruling class. George Washington was the richest merchant in America. John Hancock was a prosperous Boston merchant. Benjamin Franklin was a wealthy printer, and so on. On the other hand, town mechanics, laborers, and seamen, as well as small farmers, were swept into the people by the rhetoric of the Revolution, by the camaraderie of military service, by the distribution of some land. Thus was created a substantial body of support, a national consensus, something that, even with the exclusion of ignored and oppressed people, could be called America. Stoughton Lynn's close study of Dutchess County, New York, and the Revolutionary period corroborates this. There were tenant risings in 1766 across the huge feudal estates in New York. The Rensselaerwick holding was 1,000,000 acres. So the Rensselaerwick holding was 1,000,000 acres. Okay. I hope that don't come again. That's a difficult one. Tenants claiming some of this land for themselves, unable to get satisfaction in the courts, turned to violence. In Poughkeepsie, 1,700 armed tenants had closed the courts and broken open the jails, but the uprising was crushed. During the Revolution, there was a struggle in Dutchess County over the disposition of confiscated Loyalist lands, but it was mainly between different elite groups. One of these, the Poughkeepsie Anti-Federalists, opponents of the Constitution, included men on the make, newcomers in land and business. They made promises to the tenants to gain their support, exploiting their grievances to build their own political careers and maintain their own fortunes. During the Revolution, to mobilize soldiers, the tenants were promised land. A prominent landowner of Dutchess County wrote in 1777 that a promise to make tenants freeholders would instantly bring you at least 6,000 able farmers into the field. But the farmers who enlisted in the Revolution and expected to get something out of that found that as privates in the army, they received, I don't even know if ethically, if morally, if spiritually I could even receive this amount. They received $6.66 a month. Yeah, I don't think I could do that. I think, fuck it, I'll even take one less penny. While colonels received $75 a month. They watched local government contractors like Millican Smith and Matthew Patterson become rich, while the pay they received in continental currency became worthless with inflation. All this led tenants to becoming a threatening force in the midst of the war. Many stopped paying rent. The legislature, worried, passed a bill to confiscate Loyalist land and add 400 new freeholders in the 1,800 already in the country. This would mean a strong new voting bloc for the faction of the rich that would become anti-federalists in 1788. Once the new landholders were brought into the privileged circle of the Revolution and seemed politically under control, their leaders, Millican Smith and others at first opposed to adoption of the Constitution, switched to support. It's a real long way, real paragraphical way of saying they sold out. And that's the thing. Nah, hold on. Let me finish this. And with New York ratifying, adoption was ensured. The new freeholders found that they had stopped being tenants, but were now mortgagees, paying back loans from banks instead of rent to landlords. It seemed that the rebellion against British rule allowed a certain group of colonial elite to replace those, to England. Giving some small benefits to small landholders and leaving poor white working people and tenant farmers in their very much old situation. What did the Revolution mean to the Native Americans? the Indians. They had been ignored by the fine words of the Declaration and had not been considered equal, certainly not in choosing those who would govern the American territories in which they lived, nor in being able to pursue happiness as they had pursued it for centuries before the white Europeans had arrived. Now, with the British out of the way, the Americans could begin. Now, with the British out of the way, the Americans could begin the inexorable process of pushing the Indians off their land, killing them if they resisted. In short, as Francis Jennings puts it, the white Americans were fighting against British imperial control in the East and for their own imperialism in the West. Before the Revolution, the Indians had been subdued by force in Virginia and in New England. Elsewhere, they had worked out modes of coexistence with the colonies. But around 1750, with the colonial population growing fast, the pressure to move westward onto new land set the stage for conflict with the Indians. Land agents from the east began appearing in the Ohio River Valley, on the territory of a confederation of tribes called the Covenant Chain, for which the Iroquois were spokesmen. In New York, through intricate swindling, 800,000 acres of Mohawk land were taken, ending the period of Mohawk-New York friendship. Chief Hendrick of the Mohawks is recorded speaking his bitterness to Governor George Clinton in the Provincial Council of New York in 1753. Okay. So this is a quote. "Brother, when we came here to relate our grievances about our lands, we expected to have something done for us, and we have told you that the covenant chain of our forefathers was likely to be broken. And brother, you tell us that we shall not be redressed at Albany. That we shall be redressed at Albany. But we know them so well, we will not trust them, for they, the Albany merchants, are no people, but devils so. As soon as we come home, we will send up a belt of wampum to our other brothers, the other 5 nations, to acquaint them the covenant chain is broken between you and us. So, brother, you are not to expect to hear of me any more. And, brother, we desire to hear no more of you." Wow. When the British fought the French for North America in the 7 Years' War, the Indians fought on the side of the French. Think about that. The French were traders, but not occupiers of Indian land. While the British clearly coveted their hunting grounds and living space, the Indians' hunting ground and living space. Someone reported the conversation of Shingas, chief of the Delaware Indians, with the British General Braddock, who sought his help against the French. Shingas asked General Braddock whether the Indians that were friends to the English might not be permitted to live and trade among the English and have hunting grounds sufficient to support themselves and family. On which General Braddock said that no savage shall inherit the land. On which Shingas and the other chief answered that if they might not have a liberty to live on the land, they would not fight for it. Damn. When the war ended in 1763, the French, ignoring their old allies, ceded to the British lands west of the Appalachians. The Indians, therefore, united to make war on the British Western fronts. This is called Pontiac's Conspiracy by the British. But a liberation war for independence is the words used by Francis Jennings. Under orders from British General Geoffrey Amherst, the commander of Fort Pitts gave the attacking Indian chiefs, my fault. It's getting windy. Hold on, give me a second. Hold on. Where was it? Okay. Under orders from British General Geoffrey Amherst, the commander of Fort Pitts gave the attacking Indian chiefs, with whom he was negotiating, blankets with a smallpox hospital. Blankets from the smallpox. My fault. Blankets from the smallpox hospital. It was a pioneering effort at what is now called biological warfare. An epidemic soon spread among the Indians. Despite this, and the burning of villages, the British could not destroy the will of the Indians, who continued guerrilla war. A peace was made, with the British agreeing to establish a line at the Appalachians, beyond which settlements could not and would not encroach on Indian territory. This was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and it angered Americans. It helps to explain why most of the Indians fought for England during the Revolution. With their French allies, then their English allies gone, the Indians faced a new land coveting nation alone. The Americans assumed, now that the Indians' land was theirs, but the expeditions they sent westward to establish this were overcome, which they recognized in the names they gave these battles. Harmer's humiliation. That's nuts to call these battles. Harmer's humiliation and St. Clair's shame. And even when the General Anthony Wayne defeated the Indians' Western Confederation in 1798 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, he had to recognize their power. Okay. Oh, hold on. Let me see. Dang. It's the wind picking up. I need to get the hand one more second. In the Treaty of Grenville, it was agreed that in return for certain cessions of land, that the United States would give up claims to the Indian lands north of Ohio, east of the Mississippi, and south of the Great Lakes. But that if the Indians decided to sell these lands, they would offer them first to the United States. Jennings, putting the Indian into the center of the American Revolution, after all, it was Indian land that everyone was fighting over, sees the revolution as a multiplicity of various oppressed and exploited people who preyed upon each other. With the Eastern elite controlling the lands on the seaboard, the poor, seeking land, were forced to go west. They're becoming a useful bulwark for the rich because, as Jennings said, the first target of the Indians' hatchet was the frontiers. The first target of the Indians' hatchet was a frontiersman's skull. Okay. Let me see how much longer we got left. Got about 13 pages left. And we got about 13 pages left. We're going to end it towards the 2/3 section, page 88. A Kind of Revolution. We're going to continue reading sometime tomorrow, maybe in the morning. People's History of the United States, one of the most revolutionary, one of the most important books that I can honestly say that I ever read. A true history, a non-biased history, a full history. So, and the same way, subscribe to our newsletter, subscribe to our podcast, May 30th Alliance Podcast, on all podcast outlets. Twitter, follow us on Twitter at M30 Alliance, and Instagram at May 30th Alliance. Day 390, the struggle continues.